Minor tech refers to the technologies that are small and not big, technologies that operate at a human scale, more peer-to-peer than client-server. Toward a minor tech refers to Deleuze and Guattari's text on Kafka, toward a minor literature, reminding us of the language, if not technology, a minority constructs within the larger grammar of technology. Toward a minor tech is also the title of a research workshop and publication that we are launching here today, right now. It is part of a series of research workshops organized by Digital Aesthetics Research Center at Aarhus University, Center for the Study of Network Image at London South Bank University, and Transmediale Festival with shifting research institutions. This year, King's College London and Varia in Rotterdam. And we thank you all for your help and support in making this happen. The collaboration has been ongoing for more than a decade. The format has changed over the years, but the idea remained the same. It is an attempt to open up the festival to emerging researchers and for them to develop their own research and own networks. Based on an open call, we invite them to take part in a collaborative process, exploring the theme of the festival in light of their own research and producing a newspaper as an intervention into the festival. Deleuze and Guattari reflect on the relation between the minor and the poor, and maybe the newspaper can be seen as a kind of poor research that one might read at a festival, give to a friend or leave behind for a stranger, poor but free. Research usually comes in the form of a journal article, accredited to a limited group of people and reviewed by peers to ensure its quality. The newspaper seeks to explore another side of research production, which is often ignored, how research is a process of sharing ideas, perspectives, and knowledge. More specifically, the participants have been asked to produce longer essays, discuss them, and shorten them into what you see today. They have also been invited to develop their arguments and produce longer papers to be properly peer-reviewed and published in the journal APRJA, coming out this summer, so stay tuned for this. So what will follow now is a series of very short presentations by the contributors to the newspaper. As there's little time for Q&A, we would also like to invite all of you to take part in the conversation. You will see a link to a pad hosted by Varia, where you can take collective notes and also use this as a mode of discussion. And you also see it here at this screen over there. But with this, I do not want to take up more time. So next speaker is Camille.
How many B's are there? Six. Five. Six. Six.
Minor tech brings the intrinsic value of scale, magnitude, and proportion into question. In its minor reconfiguration of technological relations, politics, and affect, minor tech centers alternative small networks of community and local infrastructure. In thinking through these counter dynamics between big data and small technology, the historical configuration of race as a technology of scale comes to the forefront of my critical line of questioning. Here, my research explores the implications of a shift whereby the production of race has moved from the minute anatomical scales of the body to large-scale data processing. Beginning in early modernity, marked by Enlightenment thought, the transatlantic slave trade, and early colonial contact with indigenous peoples, we see the emergence of a thread of natural scientific thinking centered around taxonomical hierarchies of the body. In this historical progression, race as a scalar phenomenon moved from the outward contours of the body to the minute, invisible so-called determinants of race underneath the surface of the skin. The 19th century discipline of phrenology, for example, the study of the shape of skulls, limbs, bones, was used to justify racial hierarchy. In the 20th century, we see another break in racial scale, moving inwards and downwards past skin and bone to the blood. The eugenics movement connected pathologies of deviance, health, and criminality to the purity of racial bloodlines. After the horrors of the Holocaust and the onset of civil rights and decolonization movements, this kind of eugenic thinking trails off. But of course, these ideas of biological race difference, these varying scales of racial thinking, are still very much entrenched at the scale of the body. By the 1990s, it seemed, from a technological perspective, that we had come to an end of this attachment to anatomical scales of race thinking. During this time, there was an emerging consensus by genomic researchers that race had no biological basis, that race was in fact a social fiction. Sociologist Paul Gilroy even identified this particular moment as the end of race itself, or a particular scalar understanding of race at least. In the 21st century context of big data processing, however, there is a sense that race is being remade not within extant contours of the body's visibility, but outside corporeal recognition altogether. While racial categories are not explicitly coded within the classificatory techniques of analytic technologies, large-scale automated data processing condense and map racializing outputs that, without critical interrogation, appear neutral. Theo Than and Scott Wark define these algorithmically generated racial formations as data formations. That is, modes of classification that operate through proxies and abstractions and that figure racialized bodies not as single coherent subjects, but as shifting clusters of data, end quote. Here I ask, what if scalar compression of the anatomical signifiers of race, the phenotypic to the microscopic to the molecular, and a movement of racecraft inwards and downwards, now exerts upwards and outwards pressures into a globalized regime of datafication? One example of this phenomenon is Facebook's ethnic affinity function, which allowed advertisers to target or exclude ethnic categories based off of behavioral data, the pages the user had liked or engaged with. These racial formations as data formations also appear in the outcomes of healthcare algorithms or predictive policing software, which increasingly rely on an accumulation of data to construct zones of suspicion, through which the racial body is interrogated and brought into question. In these examples, the scale of big data masks an insidious realignment whereby race seems to disappear, while its effects are more deeply inscribed within lived experience. Here, my research going forward aims to further explore how small tech can be mobilized towards liberatory practices of refusal that challenge scalar realignments of racialism and transform domains of experience toward an end of race futurity. In the sliding scales of racialism from the body to the cloud, how might small technologies refuse the absolute universality that big data regimes attempt to guarantee under the pretense of neutrality? And I'll end there.
Thank you. So, minor tech enables the cultivation of minor worlds. Critical renderings of virtual imaginaries are increasingly emerging today as a form of experimentation with speculative possibility. This research attempts to frame immersive worlding as a minority language that responds to the current states of emergency that we find ourselves in socially, politically, and ecologically, and it does so by rendering virtual alternatives. The recent crystallization of immersive worlding as an experiential storytelling practice situates itself within the political context of resistance through its ability to facilitate direct encounters with modes of being otherwise. As Isabel Stengers urges, these practices attempt to imagine connections with new powers of acting, feeling, imagining, and thinking through prototyping, hacking, and rendering alternatives into being. Worlding is approached here as a critical storytelling project, where the weaving together of fact and fiction serve in the creation of counter mythologies that oppose the fraught narratives of the present. The virtual, through this repurposing of the majority language of video game engines, becomes a test site for counter-narratives to our fraught present. Practices of worlding, therefore, enable us to, as Helen Palmer puts it, abandon habitual temporalities and modes of being, and think beyond ourselves, speculatively, towards possible futures and fictions. Two questions, therefore, emerge and attempt to guide this research. How can we situate and conceptualize immersive worlding as a mode of expression that operates according to its own scales within the realm of virtual game spaces? And in what ways do these world artifacts constitute a minority language within the majority language of mainstream immersive media? Similarly, the turn towards immersive world design is enabled by the recent deployment of game engines towards critical digital experimentation, which has been enabling artists to produce increasingly complex digital artifacts. Similarly to the properties of a minor language that Deleuze and Guattari formulate in their analysis of Kafka's writing, today's turn towards the production of virtual worlds as sites of alternative possibility is deterritorializing the existing entertainment-centric and economically driven mode of existence of immersive game productions. When the majority language of the game engine is deployed into the minor territories of experiment and social critique, the connection of the audience with political immediacy becomes facilitated through the experimental readings that are enabled in these works. These minor worlds are emerging amongst the majority worlds of mainstream immersive media and become experimental sites of possibility for new vectors of creative expression. They attempt to push beyond existing master frameworks of traditional gamified experience and into the realm of Deleuze and Guattari's experiment, where predefined interactive structures are replaced with ever-evolving assemblages and their effect constellations. Thank you.
Minor tech can cause major problems, like QAnon. While discourses on the topic of the far-right phenomenon are often characterized by a certain immensity of scale, like the content of its conspiracy of everything worldview, or events like January 6th, what produced the scale we see here cannot be understood entirely as a result of the techno-social infrastructures of big or major tech. Rather, I would like to argue that QAnon is best understood as an assemblage of minor techs, small-scale, contrarian practices and infrastructures whose very granularity produces the conditions for the aggregation of QAnon into the enormous phenomenon that it is understood to be. Regarding practices, the term do your own research is instructive. Among QAnon's myriad and often opposed epistemic factions, the injunction to do your own research is a shared refrain and characterizes participation in the phenomenon as more than simple belief, but as the result of the individual establishing the veracity of the phenomenon for themselves through doing said research. Within QAnon, research is largely oriented around the interpretation of the world in terms of the ambiguous missives from the anonymous, eponymous figure Q. Said missives are known as Q drops, and across the 4,966 posts describing the machinations of Donald Trump's effort to fight the so-called deep state, the Q drops form the text of QAnon. Herein, the task of the QAnon participant is to map elements of particular Q drops to events in the world, taking the contingencies that produce the present and scaling them down into elements that can be found in the Q drops. However, as the Q drops were originally posted to the anarchic and largely unarchived image boards of 4chan, then 8chan, and finally, presently, 8kun, how can such research occur? One of the most consequential infrastructures associated with QAnon are precisely those which make such research possible, the Q drop archives. These QAnon participant built and maintained infrastructures scrape the image boards for Q drops and consolidate these materials into a single interface, as well as providing the user with an array of research-oriented affordances, which have themselves grown increasingly complex over time. Let's take QAnon.pub as an initial example. QAnon.pub was the first of such infrastructures, and it was established in March of 2018. In its interface, users are presented with the content of Q drops, their text, some images, some basic metadata, and the odd bit of explanatory materials accessible by the answer button. And as far as affordances, a filter-based search. Now let's compare that to QAG. QAG was established in April of 2019 and enables the analysis of Q drops far beyond their kind of content. This includes actual and imaginary metadata, and numerological reductions of both, measurements of the temporal interval between Q drops, which are called deltas. They will scan images for potentially encrypted additional information, and much, much more, pushing the kind of semiosis of a given Q drop towards, but never reaching the point of, exhaustion. The increasing granularity of how Q drops are applied in research afforded by QAG reflects a broader tendency towards the molecular in the research of QAnon participants. And these individual acts of research accumulate into a worldview that I feel is best captured but in the Q web by the QAnon participant and artist Dylan Lewis Monroe. Ultimately, what is represented herein would not have been possible without the Q confluence of minor tech strategies, do your own research, and infrastructures, the Q-Drop archives, which created the conditions from which the aggregation understood to be QAnon occurred. Addressing the problem of QAnon therefore requires grappling with its scales, and moreover, an awareness that minor is not necessarily always good.
Hello? Minor tech. Minor tech reminds me to Wendell Berry's reluctance to buy a computer in the late 1980s. Bemoaning digital technologies and increasing dependence on a strip mine coal, Berry wrote, "How could I write conscientiously against the rape of nature if I were in the act of writing implicated in that rape?" End of quote. And went on to defend his very particular writing style, which involved only writing during the daytime and using a mechanical typewriter. Berry also prescribed a list of injunctions to evaluate technological innovation, including that all new technologies ought to be cheaper, at least as small in scale and consume less energy than their predecessors, be repairable, and not disturb community relations. These prescriptions, you might recognize, echo many of the criticisms that can be levied against big tech or major tech today, with its supranational powers, polluting data centers, opaque corporate governance, and profound and often nefarious influence in social relations. Take, for example, Anna Singh's critique of scale and scalability, a version of which has been picked up by a number of related initiatives, cooperative, community-driven, horizontal, decentralized, federated, that, quote-unquote, resist the scale as a deliberate counterpoint or countermeasure to corporate big tech. An example of this is, for example, the Small File Photo Festival, right, which questions the, quote, endless growth of higher and higher resolutions. Now, I share many of the concerns proposed by the unchecked corporate takeover of digital technologies, and I'm very also sympathetic to the political dimensions of these arguments. I am less persuaded, however, by their tactical choices, by specific tactical choices and concrete instantiations of what I would call, in reference to Berry, the digital pastoral. To stick with the scalability, it seems to me that it's a future of technological systems that can be more easily resisted when one is thinking about art festivals and niche online communities, and not so much when one thinks about the global systems that regulate network communications upon which millions of people depend on every day. I am not entirely convinced that non-scalable technologies are the best way to address the needs of the Global South, for example, with its vast populations and very, very large pressing problems. Intuitively, I tend to believe that the vast majority of the world cannot afford not to think at a scale on the face of the systemic threats that beset the planet and our collective survival in it. I am skeptical about minor tech for many of the same reasons that I'm skeptical about Berry's arguments. I think he fundamentally misunderstands the nature of technological innovation. And in following these injunctions, minor tech risks misunderstanding how people already depend on large-scale systems, systems that certainly can and ought to work better, more fairly and more democratically, but probably will not and should not cease to exist. We might not like our dependence on these systems, and individually we might even be able to retreat from them, but I would caution not to confuse this desire for individual emancipation with our collective responsibility to the many who cannot afford to resist the scale. The issue for me is not how to avoid the scale or resist the scale, but rather who decides what to scale and how. This is, I want to clarify, and I want to end on this note, is a very optimistic skepticism about minor tech. I think in the name it has all the potential. It does not have to stay minor. It might come of age and perhaps come to enact some of its very clearly intellectually rich criticisms in broader social arenas. Who knows? Some of it might in fact be scaled much better than we think. Thank you.
MinerTech has the ability to influence how language models speak. Since its release in November 2022, a hype occurred around ChatGPT, a large language model and chatbot whose generated text often seems so coherent and convincing that it might be difficult to distinguish it from human language. The technology is seen as revolutionary for many fields, such as education, science, and the creative industry. At rapid pace, large language models such as GPT-3, BERT, or Lambda have been released. At the heart of this development lies the promise that the larger the underlying dataset, the better the performance. Large language models are trained with datasets scraped from platforms like Reddit, Wikipedia, and Twitter, as well as huge amounts of books of various kinds. The topics discussed in those threads and articles become the internal knowledge of the models. Generally, the models cannot learn after the training is completed. This means that the knowledge incorporated in the language model is static, implicit, and thus inaccessible. The output of the language models might sound convincing and semantically correct, but actually be bullshit. It can be outdated and factually wrong or reproduce various societal biases. Moreover, the training comes with a high cost and has been associated with a heavy environmental footprint. In response, there have been demands to scale the language models down and use the training with significantly less data. This is associated with a better understanding and controllability of the outputs, as well as an increase in overall efficiency, as they should be cheaper and more ecological. The decrease in training data is supposed to decrease the incorporated knowledge. Small language models will know less. This is good, tweeted technology entrepreneur David Chapman in October, adding that they should retrieve knowledge from a defined text database instead. The linking of external databases such as Wikipedia with large language models is already a common practice. They are considered as sources of comprehensive and up-to-date knowledge. The models are trained to extract information from database articles to be then casually inserted into a text or conversation without sounding like an encyclopedia entry themselves. The articles, and thus the knowledge of the database, is seen as being explicit, accessible, and adaptable. The linking of small language models to external databases, I want to argue, represents a transversal shift in scale. While the size of language models is downscaled, the linking with databases implies a simultaneous upscaling. By linking it to databases and archives, the world appears once more extractable, computable, and thereby knowable. In this regard, it follows a colonial logic. At the same time, however, this architecture represents an altered access to knowledge and has subversive potential. Databases are inherently open for new forms of expression and connection. The questions of how machines are supposed to speak and who has the authority and the means of building and adapting these programs are highly political ones. The discussed architecture has been opened up for a variety of actors outside of big tech, and thus might be considered a minor tech.
Okay. So I'm not going to make an attempt to assess what minor tech is, but instead spend a little bit of time thinking through some of the theoretical commitments that we make when we frame this subject. So my initial claim is that big theories about advanced technologies are burdened by ambiguities of scale. So on one hand, we have this kind of grand planetary computation direction, and on the other hand, this kind of zoomed-in investigation that characterizes the philosophy of mind and kind of technological equivalence. And this basic setup tracks with Robin Mackay's problematization of the relation between the local and the global scales, and the invocation of those categories in his conceptualization of so-called site-specific art practice. And he levels a warning when he writes about this, which I'm going to quote. The vague notion that, for instance, the entire universe is compacted into every site, giving rise to invocations of the type, "we are all made of stardust," a sentiments which, whether uttered in a mood of wonder or cosmic desolation, effectively put an end to any navigation of the space of knowledge. So with that in mind, a maximally kind of non-controversial illustration of this scalar setup looks something like this. But again, like Mackay's assessment of the local and the global being manipulated in site-specific practices, this intuitive view of scale fails to capture the emerging tendencies in art and technology in which the macroscopic and the microscopic are horseshoed into speculations of collective or planetary scale cognition. And I give here the example of global workspace theory, which is kind of a prevailing and popular theory of planetary scale cognition, but other versions of planetary scale cognition are available. So perhaps these tendencies come from seeing technologies, and especially art-adjacent technologies, as outputs or artifacts to be evaluated in post-production rather than a kind of distributed and simultaneous field of research and development. But in raising this question, we could ask, is there a different level of granularity that we could work from in the first place? So the problem is, in some ways, can be articulated in a straightforward way, but the solution is considerably more complicated. And in fact, I don't see that there's necessarily one specific solution, but a broad range of counter strategies that could be leveled simultaneously. And these counter strategies can be both conceptual or practice-based. But I'm going to offer one kind of way of thinking about this conceptually. So, for example, Hannah Arendt posits that human activity is situated in the interdependent field of the space of appearances, in which thought and deliberation take place as common and collective activities. Here our world is understood partly as a composition of human artifice, built together through work at the scalar level of the interpersonal, as Patrick Hayden terms it. The world in this view is always implicated in human relations. And this is not to say that we don't engage in analysis across scales, but rather that we can kind of ground our analysis of technology and its developmental context in this level as a place to begin our inquiry. If we want to understand technological development at the scale of conglomerate companies, for example, then we might seek permission to access their personnel or their environs and engage the toolkit of science and technology studies. But if, as the theorist, one is interested in how artist systems stand to operate as blueprints for alternative or minor technologies, they should seek the hospitality instead of artists themselves and the institutions that sometimes house the most intensive technical research practices and experiment with new ways of engaging reciprocally. And in our workshop, we discussed some other solutions different to this as well, and I have a note of them here. But I'll end there.
Minor tech opposes big tech. Machine learning algorithms range search engine results, filter out spam emails, recommend what we should read, watch, and buy. Machine learning algorithms differentiate cats from dogs, as a common example shows, but they also detect credit card fraud, predict crime before it takes place, scan job applications, and recognize cancer. Machine learning systems are built on the belief that the messiness of our world is translatable into calculable streams of data. In the training of machine learning systems, these data streams are processed through operations described as smooth and efficient, each iteration in the learning process being an attempt for optimization for the best possible fit. However, these systems cannot hold what they promise. As they cannot be separated from the cultural sphere in which they operate, they are not only mirroring the biases of our society, they are further deepening them, resulting in the discrimination of people along lines of race, class, and gender. Compass, as one example, is the US-American crime prediction software that was found to be biased against Black people. And in 2018, Amazon's hiring algorithm was reportedly discriminating against women. As solution, in the US, big tech companies propose AI democratization. They promise AI for everyone, tools for everyone, and benefits for everyone, as well as universal, all-inclusive accessibility, participation, and transparency. This translates to a growing simplification and automation of machine learning interfaces and platforms, the open source provision of infrastructures, and the offer of free educational resources. This democratization of AI, however, can only be understood as measures to ensure for company-owned products to be the main means for the development of machine learning and to advance their infrastructural power. As a result, the research, development, and the learning of machine learning is heavily informed by a capitalist logic, significantly shaping the problematic impact of machine learning operations. Rather than providing access for everyone, what we need to strive for is a radically different approach to the creation of machine learning, which breaks with the values of scale, optimization, and efficiency that have been nourished for decades. One way might be to follow Anat Singh's non-scalability theory as, and I quote, alternative for conceptualizing the world, which pays attention to the mounting pile of ruins that scalability leaves behind, unquote. For machine learning, this could mean to acknowledge the limitations that it poses, concerning the messiness of reality and the impossibility of lossless translation, but also the messiness of the machine learning process itself, dealing with dirty data and the political notion of discrimination. But do we then need minor machine learning? In practically engaging with the technology, in learning to do machine learning, and in interacting with its platforms, libraries, and datasets, we need to strive for critical technical practices. We should oppose big tech's tendency to hide away machine learning operations behind obfuscating interfaces that we are the users of, and look behind them in order to gain a deeper understanding of the technical operations and to acknowledge their embeddedness in our world. In fully understanding this condition, we sooner or later need to ask, is machine learning the best possible way to do data filtering and classification? Or might we rather seek for other technological means, other minor technologies that are not intrinsically built on notions of scalability?
Hey, so yeah, minor tech is about the what's, but it's also about the hows. Very much in line with that first comment there. Thanks, whoever wrote it, because it's very articulated, much more than I could ever be. And I'm saying that because I want to share with you today a project, one of these critical heritage projects that uses digital technologies, volumetric replication, 3D scanning, etc., to increase, amplify, subvert, transform access to museum collections. And the project that is called Our Collections, Nossos Acervos in Portuguese. It was part of a larger project on museum infrastructures and information systems that we did connected to a museum in Brazil, a state museum, very small. And we scanned 20 pictures in their collection volumetrically, and we released really large hi-fi 3D models online under Creative Commons licenses and etc. Amazing, so many polygons. But we had a problem, which is how do you actually reach our audience, our publics? How do we actually have people appropriating these things? Because, I mean, the computers you need for that, the kind of digital literacy you need for that is kind of tricky. And so what we did was create Instagram filters, which is the controversial part. But the thing is that if you go to a public school in Brazil, people have their mobile phones and they know how to use Instagram filters. So that's how we managed to reach high and elementary school students. We gave these filters, I mean, they are online, they are free, but we connected to teachers and we told them about these, and we used this as a kind of way for the students actually do stuff with the paintings under the guidance or in conversation with their teachers. So here's some pictures of the students having fun with pictures, with paintings in Brazil. And I think that's it. Thanks so much.
Minor tech is ambiguous to me. Anat Singh sees scalability as inherently tied up with processes of alienation and extraction, and writes that scalability of labor lies at the foundation of capitalism. She gives the example of plantations where enslaved people were reduced to interchangeable cogs in the machinery of Western wealth expansion. The topic of my research, as you see, is blockchain technology. And indeed, it sometimes reminds me of a plantation, a system that reworks whatever it encounters into tokenized and tradable items with little regard for the thing it tokenizes, all under the header of the value revolution, a new moment in capitalist logic of growth. The promise is that through blockchain technology, things that previously escaped the formalized market can now be standardized and capitalized upon, and the market's colonization of life can be further expanded. Nemus NFT, pictured here on the right, quite literally, and it seems unwittingly, reproduces the sectioned character of land that we remember from the logic of ownership that plantations introduced centuries ago. Nemus sells NFTs of bits of the Amazon forest, ranks them in terms of rarity, like is there a cave or a waterfall, it adds value. And through a connected, distributed, autonomous organization, it ultimately adds a new layer of privatized and gamified ownership and agency onto some of the most precious resources for life on Earth. Not all blockchain projects are this on the nose, I have to admit. But Anat Zin also writes that non-scalability is by no means better than scalability just by being non-scalable. For my contribution to the workshop, I attempted to find hope there nonetheless. There are artists and designers that are exploring how blockchain's logic can be subverted to make space, however minor, for different ways of relating in non-financialized ways. And to explore what this might mean, I've been inspired by my friend and colleague Patricia de Vries, who works on what she calls plot work as an artistic praxis, which builds on decolonial theorist Sylvia Wynter's description of plots, which are small, imperfect corners of relative self-determination within the context of colonial plantations. And de Vries asks how artistic work, implicated as it is in institutional and capitalist logics, how it can work to create a space for relating outside of those logics. I think a possible answer to this question comes from artist Sarah Friend, who programmed her Lifeform NFTs, on the right, in such a way that they die if they are not cared for. And care here means that the NFT has to be given away to someone for free within 90 days, and this person then takes over the caring responsibilities. Lifeforms represents little plots of care relationships, not only to the NFT, but also to those around you, calling on others to care for instead of capitalize on. And projects like these give me hope in the possibility of relating differently in and among blockchains, but they also worry me. What happens to care if it's not on the blockchain? How can these life-sustaining elements be protected from blockchain's larger logics? I don't know yet, but I think it is worth investigating.
This one. Is it this one? This one. Both. A minor tech today faces the impossibility of techniques in the way Kafka's minor literature faced the impossibility of literature. This was, as Deleuze and Guattari recounted, a double impossibility for Prague Germans to write in German and for them to write in any language other than German. Right, so does a minor tech confront the impasse for the other to actualize itself in a field premised on the other's racialized and gendered production? So that's the deadlock of becoming that becomes only in relation to the figure of power it aspires to overcome. Kafka's task to tear away a minor tech from its own language, as Deleuze and Guattari put it, is in this sense compatible with the task of a minor tech as one of working within the very networks and tools of its own techno-capitalist constitution. But this formulation quickly leads to another complication, which we can understand via Luciana Parisi as she relates back Audre Lorde's warning on the limits of the master's tools for dismantling his house to the domain of techniques. So these are the limits of rebooting the old program of poiesis, either in a tilting of the master algorithm, an acceleration of its auto-unmasking and unmaking. Poiesis, as a retooling of technical affordances for creative disrepair. Luciana Parisi and Denise Ferreira da Silva help us question what this disrepair is a repair of, when understood as a recuperation of the loss of being by the hands of automated reason and instrumental rationality. Poiesis but returns us to an idealized time, dismissive of the material indelibility of scalar colonialism, while premising creative self-actualization on the Promethean myth of enfolding machines, instrumentalizing their fungible flesh for the progress of creative man. This is just background. This is where reprising Kafka might help reformulate an alternative way. In Benjamin's partial analysis, it is precisely Kafka's refusal to find refuge in myth, in the lack of identity, to find refuge in myth, in the lack of identity between the messengers and the clerks and the porters and intermediaries that populate Kafka's dusty rooms, and what they mean, what they stand to signify, or again in the undecidability of undomesticated animals, the inhuman becoming of the incomputable cockroach's voice, that lies the kernels of Kafka's revolution, his response to the intensifying abstractions knocking at the door of his moment. Minor tech is a refusal of the mythopoietic recuperation of techniques into servo-mechanic tools for creative repair, might then parallel the Kafka machine of expression without signification. The Kafka machine expression without signification. Where the latter affects literature not merely by mishandling its tools, but driving their form into a panic of contents, unfolding inefficiently, worldling incompletely, rupturing an inorganic exodus, so might a minor tech borrow lines of escape from its majoritarian order by working to proliferate a mode of thinking found in what Gilbert Simondon already termed the margins of indeterminacy of machines, their inhuman condition. Minor tech as drawing together the capacity of automation and computation to challenge transcendence, as observed in the Kafka machine of inhuman becoming, but also in the optical unconscious of photography, in the orality of thinking, the sensibility of automata in unorthodox computation models, in the anomalous visions of interacting syntaxes, the shape of a new alien language from which it becomes indeed possible to tear out a minor tech. That's it.
Test.
Minor tech is something that comes in the shape of questions.
As a network of feminist servers, our practice is concerned with questions of vulnerability,
critical connections,
scaling out horizontal with care.
And today, those of us who are here and those of us who are not here, but to whom we send our greetings, share and inhabit effective infrastructures.
I'm Voizen. I'm a sound and infrastructure artist, and I'm entangled with Sister Server, Anarcha Server, and Liverburns.
I'm Aykarmela Netirk. I'm an anarcha feminist hacker. I'm part of Feminist Ninja and in the process of joining Sister Server.
I'm Nate, they, them pronouns. I'm a techno-feminist researcher with a background in cultural studies, and I'm slowly becoming part of Anarcha Server and Sister Server.
Hi, Marte, pronoun O, so we, a radio maker and also a performer. We have deep history with Sister Anarcha Server, active in Sister Server and frequently visiting Tribidou. And also, yeah, we know Liverburns.
We approach feminist servers as emancipatory spaces where we share and develop our technical skills and take care of our bodies, machines, and tools alongside feminist pedagogies. So in this case, a server is not just a technical infrastructure, a computer, but it becomes an effective infrastructure to us. which is shaped by the relations that form around it. And with effective infrastructure, we mean something that is situated, so it has a place and a time that is visible to us, that we can perceive, and that makes it easier to avoid invisualized labor and to depend more on the care and work by friends and allies.
Yeah, for example, like I have data, I want to store it, I communicate, and I don't want to have it in a sterile, generic environment. I want to know who is involved in which collective support it's carried by. So also when it fails or it's not available, maybe we can restore the backups.
I love digging infrastructure and tools I'm using and engage with every day and in my practice, and how personal all this becomes throughout, and also with whom I get connected through these processes.
We can upgrade the old feminist slogan, personal is political, and say personal data is political. Under contemporary cis heteropatriarchy, within the current matrix of domination, our effective labor that produces our personal and political data is exploited through vectors of information owned by cis men. That is why, as Feminist Ninja, we published our video on a feminist video platform, a PeerTube instance hosted by Sister Server.
PeerTube is free and open source software. We are hosting such software on our server. And this makes it our PeerTube instance. And such different PeerTube instances can be interconnected through several protocols. And such interconnectedness, this decentralized practice, is referred to as federation or federating.
And now you see some glimpses of the videos that are hosted currently. So the first stage of the project was setting up, and the second stage is a project called 360 Degrees of Proximities, and it is an embodiment of this protocol of feminists federating, both technically and socially.
This means we are reaching out to feminist collectives that are looking to host their own video platforms. Instead of centralizing our own platform as a singular dependency which accommodates different communities, together we aim to empower ourselves and others by federating feminist servers, building a feminist internet.
So hello, I'm Shushan. I'm talking about how user subjectivity is entangled with technological scale. So minor technology invokes users differently than big tech platforms. And I start with an observation I made in fall after Elon Musk bought Twitter. There was a lot of discussion about alternatives to move to. And one of the alternatives was Mastodon. That is a network of servers that are connected, or they call it federated. And it is not corporate owned, so it is run mostly by collectives or individuals or nonprofit organizations. And it's still, even if it has grown substantially, you have the numbers up there, it's still quite small. So moving to Mastodon is moving through technological scale, and it was experienced often as a crisis in subjectivity. It is a screenshot of a tweet of a friend of mine. And he said, as long as the alternatives, like Mastodon, are by nerds, for nerds, this discussion is of little use. And part of this problem is that it's not only a question of scale, as already noted in the comments, but it is also a question of how things are organized. So with Mastodon, we have a return of the servers, and the servers are on big platforms, they are completely abstracted away. So we don't just know how many servers Twitter use for running. And if you want to sign up for Mastodon, you need to pick a server. And we just seen that there are like 17,000 servers, so that is quite a choice you have to make. And you have to, in order to make that choice, you have to identify yourself quite differently in order to be part of a network than on big corporation platforms. And that means you have to choose a specific context to join. And that specific contextuality is on big platforms completely abstracted away. So, and this crisis in subjectivity, it's not just a crisis of individual subjectivity, but it's also a crisis of collective subjectivity. And for that, we have that term, the subject positions. They are like the background of individual subjectivity. So they offer a place and a role model or a cultural imagination to make sense of the world. So to be a user as part of technological practice is such a subject position. And what I find very interesting is that it is also an aesthetic position in the sense that it offers a place where practice becomes possible. So, and I'm also referring to feminist server or trans-feminist servers, and as we have seen from the group before, it's lived practice. But it's also a thing to think through relationality of technology. So there are two documents, an older and a newer one. The older is called the Feminist Server Manifesto, and the newer one is the Trans-Feminist Server. And what they do is they position the servers as a protagonist. So they talk about the server. A feminist server is, a feminist server does. And in thus, they create a territory where relations can be questioned and newly defined, also relations to technology. So the relations and the both documents do that by a discussion about servitude. So what does it mean to serve, and what does it mean to be served? And in thus, they offer a different way of thinking about relating to technology and also of use. So use is then not anymore just this position of consumerist position, like the big platform user subjectivities, but it is a position of care. And as we have seen in the feminist survey, if you're part of a feminist survey, you're part of that ongoing negotiation of what it means to be served and what is necessary to serve, so the conditions for services. And use then is not that position of extraction, but it is a position of production and reproduction of the whole environment. So, thank you.
So minor tech is facing face recognition. Platform profiling is used to create neighborhoods of homophily to instrumentalize and capitalize on cognitive resonance. So we are put in bubbles of people who are the same, that like the same. This is almost impossible to avoid without simultaneously producing more data to be capitalized. A specific version of the profiling that's integrated into most platforms is the way that gender recognition is used to censor images on Instagram. So pictures with visible female nipples are erased while male nipples are allowed. So as a continuation of earlier and other campaigns, the Copenhagen-based artist Ada has launched the Intransitu project, and each Thursday since December 21, she has posted bare-breasted selfies of herself during gender transition as a challenge to the Instagram moderation protocols, as she says herself. Furthermore, she sends the images to commercially available gender recognition services, as you can see on the right. So far, Instagram has not blocked her selfies, though the other services often register her as female. However, usually they disagree in their results. So the project demonstrates the discrimination caused by letting commercial services evaluate people into binary genders judged from a normative data model, and also controlling access via US-based moral policies. It demonstrates discriminatory systems that might also control people's ability to pass borders, enter toilets, and access health services. So it's serious in that sense. Ada also reflects on what it takes to be perceived as a specific gender. And I'm quoting from, as you see on the screen, the logic seems to be short hair equals male, long hair equals female, long hair on one side only equals 50% male, 50% female. Ada turns gender recognition into a public performance in this way, which besides the discrimination points to the arbitrariness and absurdity of the gender recognition models and the binary and biased understanding of gender they build on, constructed through normative image sets. The project points to the way gender is constructed in our culture as a convincing demonstration that gender is not only biologically, but also culturally and technologically constructed as not only a gendering of faces, but also as gender recognition models, as we see here. So in transitu, consequently demonstrates how we are captured, modeled, and recognized by machine vision and profiling. As a performer, it uses this, as a performance, it uses this as a stage and to reflect on how we are being staged. Ada puts herself in the spotlight, which is not without risk, but indeed a courageous act of transgender minor tech. Even if we are controlled by these binary structures, she will not let them define her gender. In this way, she's facing face recognition and returning its gaze. Thank you.
So, minor tech to us means considering technomagic as an epistemic practice. And we started off by noticing quite a few media artists currently that were problematizing notions of the magical or utilizing magical practices in their work from indigenous knowledges, the occult, or techno-shamanism. So we came to analyze particularly the body of work of Choi Ka-fai and Social Club. And taking these concerns seriously, we were guided by two main questions. So the first one being, what does it mean to appeal to magic today in a world that is dominated by Western hegemonic and patriarchal knowledge structures? And how do we deal with magic in the current state of dominant tech? And so the theories that we operate with treat technology not as a disenchanted tool, nor as a solution to be thrown at all the world's problems. And magic is set against the capitalist notion of commodified belief, nor simply as an escape from capitalism. Rather, technomagic is actually something much more messy.
So we're thinking in terms of what technomagic is and what, by extension, minor tech might be, is a kind of a reality system which activates belief in a different way than the commodified beliefs within capitalism. And we were a bit inspired by what Mark Fisher said about capitalist realism, in the sense that it kind of protects us from the perils of belief, and he used the word perils. And magic, or technomagic in a sense, maybe creates a space where belief can be activated where it's not supposed to be activated, or where it was discredited before. And so we look at technomagic also in relation to media art primarily as ritual practices. So we say here that it makes apparent the flow of political energy in an embodied experience, and it's a very important part of it because we think about artists who use rituals and techno-mediated rituals, techno-shamanistic rituals to do that. So techno-magic, following that for us, is equals relational ethics plus capacity to act beyond the constraints of the current capitalist belief system. Here we animated our thought process a little bit. You can try and follow it to, to an extent. Techno-magic for us is about disentangling from libertarian, commodified, power-hungry, toxic, conquering forms of belief and knowledge, and instead cultivating solidarity, relationality, common spaces, and trust with non-humans, becoming familiar with the machine. Here we're thankful to the participant of the workshop, Young-Ah Kim, who is not here today, unfortunately, but she uttered this phrase, becoming familiar, and we took it on board. So we propose to take magic seriously as an ethical and epistemic practice, and we appeal to a kind of a tentative future where things like diagrammatic thought and solidarity with the dead, not just our human dead, but also non-human dead like oil, becoming more accepted, and also rituals against forgetting and making techno-spirits and conjuring worlds.
Hello? So, minor tech, for me, is a way to subvert the logic of optimization that is embedded in every fold of major digital technologies and the systems they construct. The same logic that disrupts our experiences of time, that urges us to scale and stretch and compress in ways running counter to circadian cycles and diurnal rhythms and the metronome of being together. It's a way to untangle the paradox that big tech has so tightly wrapped us in, the paradox that goes, the more time we save, the less time we have. This exact phrasing can be attributed to sociologist Hartmut Rosa, but its sentiments are widely shared and repeated. Now that we're held captive in the particular confines of the digital, we have no time for anything. We're working more than ever before with the promise of emancipation from mundane work being sold off in exchange for just a few moments of your time, until every moment is accounted for, and practicing patience is reserved for those who are not yet embroiled in the processes of optimization, whomever those lucky few might be. Optimization is what entwines the technological, the managerial, and the cultural, enforcing a forward thrust trajectory towards an undetermined point, the movement of progress that owes its logic to an imperial temporality, after Ariella Aisha Azuli. In the cultural, it surfaces in the much reviled but tenacious habits of hustle culture, a shared occasion amongst entrepreneur influencers before the inevitable burnout, reminding us through cliches on Instagram grids to rise and grind, parroting the habits of successful people that we're told to aspire to, or the bootstraps that we should be picking ourselves up by. In the managerial, optimization is epitomized in neoliberalism, a counter-revolutionary set of tendencies that celebrate individual productivity and rampant privatization as a way to secure growth for its own sake, blind to the collapse of social, psychological, and environmental fabrics left in its wake. In the digital, the outcome of optimization is twofold. Breakneck speeds of super-efficient information processing mimic instantaneity, whilst the perceived endurance of digital media feigns everlasting memory and recall, skewing timescales to become at once negligible and infinite, out of sync and out of whack, stuck in a perpetual yet ever-shrinking present. Enmeshed together in our increasingly technologically dependent world, the struggle to keep up with unchecked growth and productivity induces an exhaustion that is more than just sleep deprivation or overwork, but an exhaustion that poses an existential threat to our experiences of time and of our ability to conjure open and alternative futures. Minor tech, thus, holds the potential to resist the uncontested trajectory of optimization, and opts not for efficiency, to do and reach the most in the least amount of time, but to be satisfied in its own becoming, complete and whole. In its many iterations, minor tech might allow the fruits of its tiny little labor lay heavy but unburdened, weighed down as an object and not a fleeting process. It's to let time pass undisturbed, swirling on its own accord and uncontrolled by the push of progress. It's to succumb to the becoming of the irresistible call to rest, for an open and new future lies beyond that slumber which bookends the journey that would otherwise stretch into eternity. Thank you.
Hello. So, minor tech is an activity in the fringes, replicable but difficult to scale, scalable with care perhaps. It includes faults and might not fully compute. It is estranged and always in the process of becoming known. In the rendering of electromagnetic frequencies described in my piece, Lightning Strikes the Earth up to 100 times a second, I find spaces for thinking, perceiving, and imagining differently. The piece contains instructions that describe a simple antenna, little more than a coil of wire that constitutes the device that turns the electromagnetic field into audio. It is a very low frequency antenna, wire coiled around a small frame, the two ends connected to a split audio cable, and then connected to an audio recorder or amplifier. It is a practice of listening and doing that requires a momentary active closure of other connections, the removal of a phone or a laptop, for example, an active offlineness. It opens up possible worlds. Built as described here, the antenna is inherently wonky, unstable, and noisy. In listening, the kind of quantum listening Pauline Oliveros described, listening to listening, something else opens up. There is a surprising inclusion and perception of things elsewhere in the world, far beyond the local horizon. Lightning being the most persistent of these signals audible, even with a crude antenna such as this, sounding like the crackling of a fire or breaking of twigs whilst walking through a forest. And these sounds jostle for space with the local sounds of power lines, routers, emails, and motors. It is minor tech that involves time and duration, a slowing down, an interruption, a diversion, a distraction. As several of my peers here write, it seems prudent to share a skepticism of non-scalability. As we conduct this listening, I tried to consider whether the listener is a hobbyist, and if this is helpful or not in resisting or repairing from capitalism. How does it differ from the amateur, the hacker, or the DIYer? I think the identification of the hobbyist points to an entanglement in the global supply chains and infrastructure that are seemingly necessary to networked society. It asks again for the listener to consider how they move within this, how the components of their antenna were acquired, how is the listening shared, where are they listening, what it might sound like in the future, what it might have sounded like before. This minor tech is old tech, rudimentary, limited, and sometimes quiet. It is passed on, passed over, assembled, figured out. It is connected to a making and a playing with. It isn't enough in itself, but generates oddness and strange spaces of communication, differently networked. Minor tech is a listener listening.
They both work? Yeah, okay. Minor tech. Being almost the last one here, minor tech has been addressed in many different ways, and that is perhaps also something that defines it, that it varies. And also I think that people driven by using minor tech comes from very different backgrounds. But there are, of course, also commonalities, such as that it's driven by an urge for more privacy or for being less dependent of systems. And it's interesting who has these who can have these conversations and who enters them. I'm not going to try to define minor tech at all, but I will look through 3 different artworks very briefly that somehow uses tactics that are linking with things that you can see within Miner-Tech as well. I will do it very briefly, and then there's a kind of a product placement. We have the newspaper where you can read it more carefully later if I don't address it. So taking a bit of a step back, this interest is linked in an observation of an increasing usage of large digital platforms. And far from sitting within just a subcategory of software studies, digital platforms can be linked across architectural studies and commercial contexts. And overall, that also brings us to a problem, which is that digital platforms are incredibly vague. What defines a digital platform is difficult to define, and perhaps also something that is visible in the usage of how big crowds use digital platforms. And I quote here by media scholar Talatun Gillespie, who points that digital platforms control what can appear, how it is organized, how it is monetized, what can be removed and why, and what the technical architecture allows and prohibits, end quote. As our reliances of digital platforms increase, it also becomes increasingly important to find ways in which we can research and analyze these platforms, also outside of academia. This is why I argue, and also why I find it very interesting, what different artistic practices can contribute with, as they possibly increase a critical reflection or awareness to a broader group of users. And this allows me to ask, how do scale and situatedness appear and matter across the artworks, and how do creative contributions help to critically nuance diverse existing understandings of large-scale digital platforms? Now, here are 3 very different examples. We are at sea, on the street, and online. The first one up here in the corner is by, it's called Cosmos Cal, and it's been functioning since, I believe, 2014. It is, the page itself is nothing but links that take you to different places online where digital platform services has been intentionally misused to produce or show content in other ways. Here is an example of VPN network that was installed to present an archive during the Sandberg Institute graduation show 2019. And all the different, depending on where you were, what would show up was location dependent and intentionally disrupting the content, somehow annoyingly. On the other hand, also making aware of how the network and installations actually work. So the back end of the interface. And down in the corner, lastly, is a much more DIY approach. On C, it's very much worth it to check out, 100 Rabbits, which they are building all their software themselves, and kind of from limitations of being on C, also addressing a very environmentally conscious approach to how digital platforms do not work in such places. And I'm going to end there. Yeah.
Hello. Miner-Tech. Oh, wait a second. MinerTech is a newspaper, a printed newspaper that might travel in our bags, that we can give away to friends or collaborators and put on the tables of collective spaces and institutions. I have been closely involved in the production and design of this newspaper, together with Simon Brown, who unfortunately cannot be here today. But I'm part of a collective space called Varia, the one of the 6 V's, and work on publishing projects that involve both design and tool making to create collective publishing environments that break away from proprietary, linear, and single outcome publishing workflows. Toward the MinerTech, the newspaper is made in a wiki2print environment that brings editing and design together in one place. Both the text and design of the newspaper were produced during a 2-day sprint, which created an intense collaborative production process in which design and content emerged at the same time. Wiki2print emerged from a way of working with a set of tools that included MediaWiki, PageDS, CSS print standards, and CSS print standards for paged media. The wiki is used to write, edit, and structure all the text and visual materials, but also to sketch and design the layout of the printed publication. The content is rendered into a single page, which is turned into HTML, styled with CSS, and exported as a PDF using the built-in PDF engine of the browser. Let me show you how that looks like. The practice of working with Wiki2print is part of a longer continuum of wiki-based workflows and publications made by groups and individuals in Brussels and the Netherlands and beyond, including OSP, Constant, TTPy, Varia, and hackers and designers. The code that we use to make the Wiki2print publishing environment is published under the CC4R license again, ready to be changed, transformed, and reused again. It has been 5 years since I started to work with code and free software to make and generate publications, and it has opened a lot of possibilities and possible engagement with the environments that shape these publishing practices. For example, to make this newspaper, we worked with PageDS, which is what you see now on the screen. It renders a web page into pages. And we met the makers of this tool during an event that we organized at Varia last October. I like to think of such engagements as moments of being shoulder to shoulder. It allows me to reflect in which way we depend or interdepend on other actors in the environment. If we are shoulder to shoulder as editors and designers, how can we then work together in non-linear way as design editors? If we're shoulder to shoulder as authors and designers, how can we then be in dialogue with each other and work from possibilities instead of constraints? Which was actually something that was difficult for us to do because we were not sharing the same room when we were working on this, which complicated it a little bit. If we are shoulder to shoulder as designers and tools, how can we then make custom work environments that let tools shape practice and practice shape tools? If tools and browsers are shoulder to shoulder, then how can we get into conversation with browser makers? Now they have become such an important tool in web-to-print design practices. If we're shoulder to shoulder with tools and W3C standards for CSS print, then how can we get a voice in shaping the CSS print standards that we use in our layouts? If we're shoulder to shoulder as designers, then where can we exchange? Where can we discuss, transform, and get together with peer designers, forming space for solidarity, disagreements, and reflection? So, to come back to the term MinerTech, in this context, resonates for me with being shoulder to shoulder with those who co-shape the conditions and possibilities of a work environment. While being shoulder to shoulder with many, these design practices sometimes operate both on small scales, for example, when making custom tools and custom work environments, and other times on larger scales, when using globally used tools such as the browser. This way of working creates the possibility for me to understand the complexity of scale and to situate, to negotiate and engage with the environment I am part of and co-shape with newspapers like this. Thank you.
So I believe we have 10 minutes left, and so we do have time for a Q&A session. So if anybody wants to ask a question, I think maybe given that it's only 10 minutes, also posting a comment is also most welcome. Is there anyone? Right.
There's no questions, but I like how our minor tech has multiplied and become really, like mobile and a lot of small units in a lot of our small presentations. It's a different feeling now too.
Yeah.
You can pick a question. Maybe there are questions on the questions and comments on there already been asked.
Yeah. So, which one should you pick? To what extent is optimization part of the way we have designed software and computation to work? Is neoliberalism computationally designed? I think we know the answer to that.
Yeah, but I think also from the pad, I think there's of course been part of the presentations, but also the comments that minor tech has to do with the design, the programming, the of software, but it also has to do with how we understand, how we interact with, how we use software, and the underlying some of the discussions, of course, is also the question whether minor tech is good versus major tech being bad, or whether minor tech automatically is good and something we should work for. And then of course there's been like larger discussions about how does it relate to time, scale, race, gender. So a lot of these sort of questions have been raised throughout the last hour or so, but also in the pad. I don't know, we probably can't answer collectively to this, but it's there.
Yeah. So on that note, and we'll keep the pad running if any of you are interested in commenting, or there are also some useful links in there. I see both to if you want to take part in the feminist server federation or other things, there are links to artworks. You can go and consult the pad. But lastly, I'd also like to advertise the newspaper, and also there are a couple of people who are not present here today who couldn't make it for various reasons. One couldn't get a visa, and one was ill, and there were many reasons. But you can find additional articles in here, so please pick it up. It's available here for free, and it's also available in the reception. And I believe it's also been put in your little bag when you registered. But thank you, everyone, for coming and for taking part.